Hello. So, sorry, I should have hit that before, but I'm still a little new to Zoom. So I'm going to jump into sharing my screen and get the presentation going. Okay. So I gave you my little spiel about myself. And one of the things that's really important to me is using quality materials. So I thought this was a great way to kind of start us off. We spend so much time as artists creating our work. We want to make sure that it lasts. And something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is there are a lot of terms such as acid-free and archival that don't always mean what you think. So when you're shopping for supplies or you're you're talking to a framer, you want to use terms like conservation. When you say conservation, people know what you mean by that. When you say acid-free, there's a lot of things that are acid-free technically, but there's still some bad materials in there. So always look for conservation. I'm going to start by doing works on paper because typically works on paper require the most framing. Now, that's not, I'm also going to cover canvases and paintings as well, but just to get us started, we'll start here. And when I say works of paper, what do I mean by that? I mean pastels, photography, mixed media, collage, printmaking, anything where your substrate is a piece of paper. And for this first slide here, I also included my Master Certified Picture Framing Certificate. So you can see how I chose to frame that piece. It's kind of a fun thing. So this is, and some of these techniques, they're a little bit easier to show in person, but I kind of wanted to just open the conversation about hinging. So if you have your work on paper, and if you look at this little diagram here, the best way to mount your work is through doing a hinge. And a hinge is, it's kind of like a little tab of paper. And I have some videos and some other things that I'm going to share with you to clarify this point. But the important thing is that we're not going to use tape to go all the way around the piece of artwork and tape it to the back of the mat. And also here, we don't want to put the hinges directly on the corners. As you can see, it's like a little bit in from the corner, and that's to prevent the corner from ripping. So all of these techniques and things that I'm going to be talking about are all about how to protect your artwork in addition to displaying it. And so these are just some general information about hinging. This slideshow will also be available after the presentation. And I thought because it's a little difficult to do things hands-on in Zoom, I have these videos that I selected for you that I vetted, and I thought we could take a couple minutes just to watch those. So then afterwards, if you have any questions, I will be able to answer them for you. So just give me a second to bring those up. I guess I can do this. And I'm sorry about the ads.
Is the easy way for businesses to advertise on Hulu, reach and engage.
I did have these set up in my other browser, but I'm not sure if it's gonna go. So this person, I thought that he did a really good job. He really kind of covers a lot of it, and it's a pretty short video. It's only 4 minutes.
The conservation mount comprises of 2 pieces of mount board. The window mount with the aperture cut from the middle, and the undermount. Now it is essential that those boards are of the same quality and a minimum thickness of 1100 microns. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hinge them, and it's always essential to hinge along the longest edge. So I place the actual boards together with a slight gap. I take a strip of linen and I moisten the linen, wet it. And place the linen centrally down the gap. So, and then with my artist bone, I burnish the linen, which makes the adhesive to stick better to the board. I then take the point and run the point down the center. So, putting a little dimple in the actual linen itself, which makes it easy for the actual mount to open and close. And that is our basic conservation mount. What I'm now going to do, I am going to show you how to fix the artwork in position. I'm going to do this by using a T-hinge. And the T-hinge makes use of 2 tabs tape. And the tape I'm going to use is this tape by Linico, the Haiku hinging paper. The artwork should always be placed on the back or on the undermount of the mount package itself, never on the window mount, always on the undermount. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to put 2 tabs onto the rear of the artwork. I'm going to moisten round about 5 millimeters of the actual tab itself. And then I'm going to place it in that position there. Take my bone and just gently burnish that. Second tab again, round about 5 millimeters at the bottom. I then take the tab, place it on the artwork in that position there. So those are my 2 tabs on the back or on the verso of the artwork. I then need to position the artwork in place in the mount. So I lift the window and place the artwork in the correct position, like so. I weight the artwork, I take my tape, and I now cut 2 longer strips. That's 1, that's 2. I open the window mount, I wet the strips themselves, and then place the strips on top of the tabs, like so. You can see that I've left a small gap between the top of the artwork and the bottom of the hinge. That is to take into account that if there is any expansion of the paper, then the paper will move and return to its original position without cockling. And that is our mount.
All right. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I really love hinging for so many reasons, but I know as artists, a lot of times we need to reuse our frames from exhibition to exhibition because the frames can be expensive. And one thing that I really like about this T-hinge, which is the video that we just watched, is that if you wanted to remove this from the mat, you can slit along this top T piece that you put on afterwards right here. And then you can then reuse that mat, you can reuse the frame, you can store your artwork in a flat file, and you're basically investing in the frame and the mat, assuming that you can make artwork that is all around the same size that would be able to fit in that same mat and frame. You can also, take the mat out and store it in a flat file, and then also have that frame to put a different matted piece in. But another thing that, he mentioned the cockling. He also mentioned, well, he didn't mention gravity, but gravity is an important factor here. When you have all sides of the artwork restricted, that's when you're going to get more of that ballooning or the crinkling of the artwork, because art, paper and art, the mats, all the materials, they expand and contract with heat and humidity. So you want to be able to give them room to move and expand if needed. So that video is like a nice little intro. I also selected one here, which is how to float mount your artwork. So that would be to how to hinge it on top of a mat so you could see the entire edge. I don't know if we need to launch into that right away because I want to just talk more about the general stuff, but this will be here for you. And if there is a request to take a moment to have me walk you through that, I'm happy to share that video with you as well. Also in this presentation, I'm sure right now you're asking, okay, well, how do I get that tape? How do I get these materials? So I tried my best to give you links to everything. So if you click on this, it will take you to this website where you can actually purchase this kit right here. And they do, Karen Battles actually shared this with me. Thank you for that, Karen, because it's a great resource and they have lots of wonderful materials there at retail. So you don't have to be a wholesaler to get them. So this kit here, it includes the linen tape that you use to adhere the mat to the backing board. And it also includes the tape that goes on the artwork. And any questions about that before I move on to the next section? All right, awesome. So the next thing that I think can sometimes be overlooked is spacers and air gaps. So one thing that I feel very strongly about is the need for an air gap. I have had the misfortune recently of reframing one of a family photo that my dad gave me a while back. And there was no air gap. And because of that, the photo was stuck to the glass. And this happens with all artwork, not even pastels and charcoal. You also need to have an air gap for those. It's not just photographs. Pretty much any artwork, when you're putting glass in there, it's creating almost its own little oven, its own little sealed package. And so heat and humidity within the framing package can also really be damaging. So condensation can form on the inside of the glass here. So you always want to have a spacer. Most of the time with works on paper, you're going to use a mat, and a double mat is equal to 1/8 of an inch. If you go for those 8-ply mats that I love, the double thickness, you don't have to, that also provides the air gap. But if you decide to, if you don't want the look of a mat, totally understandable. But in that case, you would want to use a spacer. So these spacers, and again, if you click this link, it's going to take you to a bunch of different options for spacers that you can purchase. And all of those are self-adhesive. So there's like a little sticky tape backing, and you would peel that off and you would attach, you'd measure it, cut it with a pair of snippers. So like a wire cutter would work, but they also make these special kind of mitered clippers that you can buy from them if you choose, but wire cutters work fine. And you just stick that on the edge of the glass. So you can see here's the glass. That's where the adhesive on the back that you peel off is. And then this is the spacer itself, which is just a little chunk of plastic. And then the spacer rests on top of your artwork. So whether you're deciding to do a float mount on the art, so then it's on the mat board and then your artwork's here, or even if you wanted a complete no mat look, this would rest on the artwork. And it's always important to have a quality backing board. And when I say quality, again, go back to my first slide and think conservation. So I'm not a big fan of using foam core as backing. If there's one thing that I would invest in, it would be the materials that are going to be directly touching your artwork. So that would be the backing board and the first mat board. Those should always be of conservation quality. So that's a little bit about that. Now, I got some specific questions from pastel and charcoal artists. So I found this little image here because, as we know, pastels can shed. And during that shedding process, if you don't have it framed properly, then that pastel dust will end up on your mat. And then before you can submit it to the next show or, or sell it, you're going to have to take it apart and clean your mat, which can be a real pain. So I hope that between these two diagrams, they make sense. But if this is the top, this is the lip of your frame, and this is your glass, what you want to do is create what I call a pastel catch basin, or they like to call this a gutter, so that as your pastel, which is right here, starts shedding, it goes into this extra little space that you create. And this piece here, it can be made out of mat board strips. It can be made out of foam core. Acid-free foam core is a very common material to use for something like this. And it's that nice thickness for that. And then you have your mat and your glass. So when you're looking at it, you will see a little bit of dimension within the frame. So because the artwork isn't going to be pressed up against the glass and it's not going to be pressed up against the mat either, there's going to be a little bit of a gap there. But that gap is what's going to protect your mat and prevent you from having to take it apart and clean it before every single show. And this one it's the same thing. They just use different terms. So I wouldn't use a foam board backing. I would use a conservation mat board backing. But it's just another orientation of the same thing. The glass, you'd have the mat here, and then you have your spacer, and then the artwork. Any questions on that? Okay. Oh, John, you're on mute.
If you do a pastel on a pastel board, they're stiff, so that you're not using a mat, can you just put that in with a spacer?
Yes.
Does that work?
It works great. So that would be kind of going back to this one. Oops, I'm sorry about that. Where you see the artwork, and then this is the spacer goes directly on top.
Right.
So that is another way. You might develop some, with pastels, you always want to be extremely careful because you bump it and all of a sudden it starts shedding. So I have some tricks where, like, when I'm doing pastels, I like to keep them as flat as possible. And then when you turn, when you're framing them, I don't like to flip it all the way over onto its face. I will literally lean it up as I'm doing it and have my artwork like this, and then put my points and put the backing on, and I do it all while I'm holding it vertically. And that's one trick, so that the pastel doesn't get on the glass and kind of make a mess. Also, when you're the artist versus the framer, you know how to handle your own work. And if you did touch the paper and make a little smudge, you can go and fix that. So it's not the end of the world. But just from my experience being the framer and not the artist when doing these, I had to be a little bit more careful. But using a spacer is a perfectly acceptable way to do that.
And if you're using a pastel board, would you recommend using a backing board in addition? Or?
Well, yes and no. It sort of depends on the depth of your frame. So if we use this diagram here, and you see how deep this frame is and how the backing and everything fills it up, that's how you want it. You don't, now, for example, if this was how deep your frame was and you just had the glass and the board, let's call, glass, let's call this spacer and the artwork itself, and you had all of this extra space here, then I would consider filling that up. And the reason why is because it's always a nicer presentation when you have a dust cover on the back. So you can use brown craft paper, you can use black paper, you can use scrap paper in your studio, but it's nice to have that be finished, sealed. And not only is it a professional look, but the dust cover itself helps prevent bugs from getting in. And when you think about, okay, this is great, for NHAA purposes, you're going to be framing a new couple pieces every month for our member exhibitions, or maybe you're doing a body of work. But then, when you sell those pieces, where do they go? They're going to be just how they are as you presented them to your collector. And putting that dust cover on, it's easy, and it's just an extra layer of protection against bugs, and it's part of your branding as an artist, just to be able to deliver that extra touch of professionalism, put your business card on there. So if you don't fill it up, say with foam core, what can happen is you can put your finger through that dust cover very easily. And then you're like, oh, shoot, there's a big hole in the back. Now I got to patch it. Now I got to find a new piece of paper. So save yourself that frustration and just fill the back of the frame up with scrap materials, and then you don't have to worry about it. Any other things that are coming up for people? Any other clarification on anything that I've covered? Feel free to unmute and chime in. Okay, so I've also received a lot of questions about floater frames. And floater frames are, they're simple, clean, modern. They don't have a lip to them. So you can see in this diagram, you can see the entire canvas here. And there's usually a little bit of a space in between where the frame is and where the painting is. And this is a really great way to frame something and have it look clean and professional, but not have it be like a big statement. It's not like a big gold frame. It's very just clean and simple, but it does still make it feel finished, and it is a finishing touch. The other thing that's really nice about floater frames is they're pretty widely available. You can get them from Blick, you can get them from Jerry's Artorama. You can also find them like at professional framing store as well. And it's just a difference between if you need a standard size, like an 8x10, or if you want something that's a little bit more specific. So if you a big part of framing, in order to keep the cost down for artists, is about planning ahead. So knowing what size you like to work in, sourcing that size frame, those size panels, that size paper, and kind of having a plan for how it's going to all go together at the end from the beginning of your project. And I know that's really hard to do, and I'm like all for spontaneity and things emerging, or you don't like something, let's cut it. I'm all for that type of creativity, but just to, if you do have a series where you're like, okay, I'm going to do 20 paintings, or I'm going to do, 20 pieces of art, it will save you in the end if you can put some time into figuring out how to plan. Now, I got a question about plein air painting and how to frame, and if you can use floater frames. And the first thing that popped into my head for this was to use Velcro. So Velcro, especially on a small piece, like I'm thinking 11x14 and smaller, you might even be able to do a 16x20, but I would say 16x20 would be the max, and you would probably want to use a fair amount of Velcro. They make Velcro that is like, again, a self-adhesive, so it has like a sticky tape on the back. And before you start painting, put that Velcro on. Anytime you have a self-adhesive, you're gonna really want to burnish it down to make sure that you get good contact, because those types of like adhesive tapes, they don't really stick unless you put a lot of pressure. So I would, before you start painting, I would attach those Velcro pieces to the back of your artwork. I would position, then I would peel off the other side of the Velcro adhesive and put that, and then put your artwork in the frame. Make sure that you have it lined up exactly where you want it. Put a good amount of pressure on the adhesive to the Velcro attached to the frame, and then you can take it apart. And then go put it on your easel, be painting outside. Maybe it's a wet paint event and you want to sell the piece, or you want to show it professionally. You don't want to worry about finishing the sides. You can, put it back together with that Velcro. You don't need to have any power tools. It's simple. You can tell the buyer, hey, this is adhered by Velcro, but, a lot of the industrial strength Velcros will be fine. You won't need anything else. If it is a larger painting, you might suggest that they put a screw or two in. But that is something that I've done before for small pieces or for pieces that I wanted to switch out regularly. So Velcro is a great framing, mounting and framing thing. Okay, so another thing, and this is a pet peeve of mine, and I'm talking to you painters, we have a lot of paintings that are not framed in the gallery, and as long as your sides are clean or your gallery wrapped, that is completely acceptable. But the number one way that paintings are damaged is from poking. So think about this as just a way, like if you're not going to have glass or anything in the front of the painting to protect it, you can put something on the back. So I recommend for all paintings, even if they are not in a frame, to take a piece of acid-free foam core. Matte board also works really well. And if you want to get super fancy, you can use corrugated plastic. Now you can attach this to the back of your frame with just a simple staple to the stretcher bar, or you could also use Velcro again. But all of the, however, you could even use like little screws or brads. But the point here is that it's a great way to protect the back of your painting. And if you're ever in a situation where you're storing your paintings in your studio and you're leaning pieces up against each other, having the back open like that, it's just really vulnerable. So I would love for all of our artists to start adopting this and to be putting the backing on the canvas. So I just put two little images here to kind of show you an example. And I already talked about dust covers, but I threw that on here too. Is this a big surprise for anyone? Has anyone ever done this? Put a backing board on a painting, even if it wasn't framed? Just a little conservation tip.
I have a question. So there's no space between the canvas and the board?
So, I mean, I have a lot to say about if you want to be super conservation when it comes to canvases, but given that this is just, they actually do provide, in this diagram, they do recommend that you put a foam strip in between. I don't think that's really necessary. What I like to do is, if this is right here is where the canvas overlaps the back, and then you have the board, I like the board to overlap the canvas. So you just see, so just as it's just a cleaner look. And I don't know, it just makes sense to me.
You try to make it so that you cannot poke the canvas, right? So they need to be close together, right? Or am I misreading this?
So it's basically just, I'm recommending that you take a sturdy board, like a foam core or a matte board, and you staple it to the back of your canvas.
Okay, so they're
having it, like, here we go. I have like these little canvases that I was using for Christmas ornaments. Here's the back of your canvas, right? Poke, 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 poke. You know how easy it is to poke this and to damage it? So instead, let's take a piece of board, staple.
Wait, I just need to find you. Because I'm still seeing the screen, not you.
Oh, sorry. Here, do you want me to stop my screen share for a second?
Oh, there you are. I'm just trying to find the right little thing.
So here we go. Easy to damage, right? Now, sorry, this is just little scraps that I have in my studio right now. Put a board on it. Now, when you try to poke it, I'm touching the board, not touching the canvas.
Amanda, can I ask something?
Sure.
And when I'm framing something like the thing you just showed, held
Yes.
up, I put, what are they called? Eye hooks? What?
Eye hooks. Yep.
I don't like to put them facing out because then the painting angles out from the wall. So I put them on the inside of the stretcher. And then if I put the backing on, the wire.
I hear you, and I have two answers for you. First off, don't use eye hooks. Those eye screws are not, they're not good. I don't have a sample of one here, but the reason why they're bad is because you're screwing it directly into your canvas, and those eye hooks.
I mean, into the stretcher.
Into the stretcher. You're screwing it directly into the stretcher, and when you have the wire's coming up right here to make your connection point like that. And sorry, I'm just kind of doing this on the fly, but so you see we've got, and of course you wouldn't have your wire that long, but just for demonstration purposes. Now, the shape of those eye screws, eye hooks, as we're calling them, is like that. So you're putting a lot of stress, if you think physics, right here. And these can pull out of the canvas. So over time, what happens when you use something like this is it basically pulls out because you have all of this pressure from the wire on that's pulling it up and in. And so it doesn't take that long, especially if they're really short eye hooks, for those to pull out and then your painting falls on the ground. So what I do recommend is using D-rings. And I have another slide later on where I can show you some D-rings and some other framing hardware that are just way better to use. And the reason why a D-ring is better, you're like, why? That's kind of like the same thing, right? Well, just because we're getting into the science of it. A D-ring, as you know, sorry, I'm doing another little drawing. They come in different shapes and sizes, but essentially they look like that, right? And so, sorry, that's my little note about yoga. So there's your D-ring, right? Now, instead, your screw is going to go through this hole. And then the pressure from the wire, to go back to the wire diagram, is on this strong piece of metal, this plate right here. So that's not going to pull out anywhere. Instead of having the screw and the place where the wire goes be all one piece. This way you have two different pieces that are working together. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And so then you could put that right over
On
the
top
dust.
of. So you put your backing on your canvas, and then you put D-rings on top of that. And if your frame is very thin, or if you're doing something tiny like this, you're doing something micro for small works. I have another piece of hardware that I'll show you at the end. That's really pretty interesting, and that has to do with it's a similar concept of a D-ring, but it's just smaller, and they have smaller screws that you can use.
So, and then could you just clarify, if we're having a board on the back of the back side of the canvas, is it a dust cover important too?
If you were so you can't really put you don't really need a dust cover, but you do want that board to be well fitted, and you want it to cover the whole back of the canvas. And you can put bump-ons. Do you know the little rubber bumpers that go on the bottom? You can put those at the bottom of your canvas on the backing board as well.
And the backing board would attach to the back of the
To
stretcher.
to the stretchers or the strainer bars, yes.
Amanda, may I ask a picayune question
Sure.
that pertains to this? So when you put the backer board on and you're going to staple it to the stretcher boards, should the backer board, whatever the material is, be it masonite, foam core, whatever your mat board, should it come all the way to the edge of the canvas, or are you talking about doing it just to the edge of the wood stretcher bar?
I would
Does that make
say
sense?
yes, and that's a great question. I would say kind of in between, right? So like not all the way to the edge, because you don't want to see it from the side, but maybe make the board like 1 inch smaller. Or if you're doing something very small like this, maybe it would end up being like 1/4 inch smaller. So then on here, you would have like a little bit of a space around. So you don't want it all the way directly to the edge, to answer your question.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All righty, so I'm gonna jump back into the presentation.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and you can see on this diagram, Lenny, just to further explain to you how it has pretty significant space there. I would probably have the board go directly up to the edge of the canvas, but not to the edge, you know, just to where like the canvas overlap the canvas, but not go further.
Well, also, if you're going to screw your D-rings in, and you had the stretcher board, particularly if it was made out of particle board or something heavier than that board, it might be difficult to get. I use D-rings exclusively, and I usually end up screwing them in by hand. So adding a layer of, if it was some kind of birch board or something like that you were using for backing.
Yeah, I wouldn't use something that heavy. Just, you know, you don't really need to. As you can, you know, I really feel like conservation mat board would be perfect for that. And if you're working in small sizes, like I'm talking 11 by 14 and smaller, so small works type things, go to your local frame stores and say, hey, do you have any mat board scraps? Because I'm telling you, they throw out so many little odd mat board scraps, and you might have to sift through to find like a bigger piece. But if you are doing a lot of small work, you can even gesso them and use them to paint on. They're great for little studies. They're just a great material to have, especially if you start doing your own framing. So go to your frame shops and see if they have scrap mat board for you to take. And then you can start lining at least your small canvases by stapling on the scrap mat board. All right. So this is another thing for painters. This is a material called Velara tape. And I can give you, I have a source for you to be able to buy it. But also it's very easy to use. And especially if you're working in oils, especially if you're in a rush and your paint is like 99% dry, but it's not 100% cured. This is a great thing to use. So it's basically like a non-stick foam material, and you line the lip. So not the inside rabbet like over here, but the lip of the frame. So the part that's going to touch the painting. You line the lip with this Velara tape, and it prevents your canvas or your panel, your painting, from sticking to the frame. And I've, taken apart many frames because buyers, collectors, they wanted to replace the frame with something that fit their aesthetic a little bit better. And it is heartbreaking when you find that the paint has stuck to the frame, because pretty much, you can be really delicate and careful with it, but there's always going to be some damage when that happens. So you do have to be, this is a great way to prevent that from happening. And because it'll take you, 2 minutes longer to finish framing your piece if you're doing it at home, there's really no excuse not to use it. Has anyone heard of this? It's usually more popular in sort of conservation circles, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was a new thing for people, but it's really super easy.
I never heard of it before, I'll admit.
Well, Lenny, as a plein air painter, you gotta start using this.
Okay.
Okay, so now that is, are there any other technical questions? Because my next slide is gonna, and for the rest of my presentation, I'm gonna go into frame design. So now is your time to ask me about technical questions. I have some more scrap paper. I might draw you some more impromptu diagrams, but let me know if you have any other technical questions.
Yeah, Amanda, I do oil paintings. A lot of times I'll do them on the panels. I usually just use like a mirror clip on the back to hold them in place. Is that a good way to do it?
My favorite thing to use are offset clips. And this will, maybe now's a good time to take a minute to kind of show you around that supply website that I was telling you about. So I'm going to go back to screen share. So let's go here. So this is this website that I was telling you about. It's the 888 Manufacturing. Thanks again to Karen Battles. And what's really nice about this site is it's super easy to use. So I'm just going to click in this search site here, and I'm going to search offset clips. And then all of this stuff comes up about canvases. And if you are doing, if your frames are the right size for your, if your panels or your canvases are the right size for your frames, and it's perfectly flush on the back, plus your backing board, then something like this is what's going to work for you. And you'd only have to put the screw in the frame. You don't have to use both screw holes, but I like that these have both because it just adds a little bit of flexibility for you. Now, if your frame is a little bit too thin, it's not deep enough for your painting, then you can measure, and they have all of these different heights. So these are really great. So you can say your frame fits in flush, but then you're going to put a little backing board in. Well, maybe you want the 1/8 inch, put a nice 1/8 inch piece of foam in there. Or if you have, if you need a lot more space, you can go with one of these. And I have, I definitely put some time into this. I have to say, I've seen many canvases come through NHAA where there's like 2 offset clips, or there's like 2 staples. And I would say at a minimum, you want 4, top, bottom, left, right. Now, if you're doing a 16 by 20, an 18 by 24, if you're doing a, 30 by 48, if you're doing something big, you're going to want a lot more of these. I would say you want to put them probably every 6 inches or so, just to really make sure that it's really secure in there. You don't want anything coming loose. You don't want to, it's just easily avoidable with the right hardware. So I hope that this helps. This website has a lot of really fun hardware that is going to be like, well, I kind of want something that was this size and it was like this. Search on this website. It's really good. And is there anything else that I can look up for people on this website to see if there's something that we can help you find? A framing supply or a piece of hardware?
You talked about that Valero tape and also the linen tape.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. So this is the Velara. And this one, unfortunately, right now is out of stock. But you can find it on other sites. If you just kind of like copy paste this into your Google browser, you can probably find it on another site. You can also get this one, and instead of 1/4 inch, it's 1/2 inch, which means that you can cut it in half, and then you get actually more this way. And if your frame rabbit isn't a 1/4 inch, which sometimes they are smaller, you can use this one and cut it, and it ends up being kind of a custom size piece of Velara for whatever frame you're using. So this is what I would get. Some other things we talked about were D-rings. So these are great. There's so many different sizes. So like these are super baby tiny ones. And then these are your more standard size. And you can, what I really like about this website is you can buy 100 pack for $7.50. You know, the 1,000 pack is definitely for professional framers, but you know, if you're making a lot of work, go for it. If you're doing really large pieces, you can go for the 2-hole or the 3-hole. Especially if there's a frame on it and you have a lot of weight, you definitely want to make sure that you have the appropriate size hanger and the appropriate weighted wire for hanging on the back. My
Amanda,
favorite,
sorry.
go
May
for
I
it.
ask you a question about just going back for a moment to offset clips? Because I have jars of them in my studio. And then if I switch the type of frame, or I switch what I'm painting on from a flat linen archival panel that I take a stack when I'm plein air painting away from home, like on Monhegan Island, it's easier to do the flat linen panels. If I'm at home, I might be using a gallery wrap or something. But then when I go to frame them, like you need all different size offsets. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone and grabbed out all my jars, and of course I never have the right one. I end up taking a hammer, trying to make it smaller or trying to make it flatter, because
Yep.
if you don't properly cover it or put enough bumpers on it, it's going to scratch the paint on your client's wall.
Yes. So I have a couple hacks for that. Instead of using a hammer, definitely use a pair of pliers. Pliers will be better for that. And 2 pliers hold, because it holds one side of the offset clip with one pair of pliers and the other with the other, and then just give it a little pressure and you'll get there. The other thing is, I'll go back to offset clips so we can take a look at them. For those smaller panels that you're talking about, like the ones that, are just like the little linen ones, these flat ones are probably what you want. Now, if you put them in the frame and you have a bunch of gap, like you don't have, like the panel doesn't fill up the frame. This is where you want to put your foam core, your acid-free mat boards or your conservation mat boards behind it, and fill that up to the point where when you go to put this on, the materials that are inside the frame are flush with the back of the frame, and that will help you. And that's another trick too. Like if you have like this 1/8 inch clip here, adding that backing board to the back of your canvas is going to change the depth that you need for your frame. Use that to your advantage with your offset clips. So if you find, oh, I have offset clips that are too big, put a nice piece of foam in there to fill it up. That'll help bridge the gap between the offset clip and the back of the painting. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Another thing is, if you are, these offset clips are great for canvas, but if you're working on paper, then you might want to get a what's called a point driver. So this is under fitting tools. And these are a bunch of different types of point drivers. I like the ones that do the flex points. So I would probably go for this Logan right here. But it's also totally fine to go with like the least expensive ones and try it out and see how committed you are to framing your own stuff. I also love the pneumatic one, but you know, we're artists, right? We're not professional frame shop. So you don't really need to splurge on the pneumatic tools unless you're going to start building your own frames. And that's a whole other class, but we can talk about that then. But something like this with the flexi and rigid points, these are great. I like the flexibility there. And these are really easy to use. You just hold it up to the side of your frame, pull the trigger, and it shoots a little dart-like thing into the wood that will hold your frame package, which is your artwork, your matting, your glass, all of that inside of the frame. And this is similar to what I was saying about putting, you know, those 6 inches for the offset clips. You want to put more points than that. I would say you want to put them, depending on how big your piece is, every, I would say 3 to 4 inches.
Amanda, I wanted to also point out that on that website, they have that ATG tape, which adheres the dust cover. You told me about that. It adheres the dust cover to the frame. That's a handy thing.
Yes, great point. So these are ATG tapes. They're double-sided tapes. You can get the ATG dispenser guns right here, but you can also use them manually. And I think this is the one that you got, Karen. This is the fillet tape. It's a little bit thinner. So if you're using thin frames, this is a good option. This is the one that I'm the most familiar with. Now, this is the perfect thing to just like quickly put on the back of your frame and then put your brown paper or your whatever kind of paper you want to use. I wouldn't use newsprint, but I would do brown paper as the lowest quality. Some people use black, some people use acid-free. But go ahead, and this is a great way to attach that. And there's other uses for it too. I use it a lot if I'm doing a double mat and I want to put, you know, connect my double mats together. I'll put this on the back of my top mat and then secure that on top of my bottom mat, if that makes sense. All right.
Can I ask one more question, Amanda?
Go for it.
If you're using a floater frame on a canvas on stretcher bars, then you drill from the back of the floater frame has a back side, and you drill from the back into the stretcher bars to attach it to the picture.
Yes.
So then I assume you would put the D-rings on that back piece of the frame, and then you would put the backboard within that piece and attach it directly to the stretchers. Is that right? Did that make sense?
So let me draw you a little diagram so we can make sure that we're on the same page here. I'm gonna try to get a darker pen here. Okay, so sorry it's backwards. I should have realized that my camera is mirrored, but we've got your floater frame right here.
Can you
Now-
stop the screen sharing so I can see
Yes.
better? Thank
Sorry,
you.
thank you for that. I'm not always great with Zoom. Okay, so we've got our floater frame, which is right here. We've got your canvas or your artwork, your panel right here. I would totally put my backing board in between because that's a way to hold it in place. Now on here, you do want to be careful because you want your screw to come in and grab your stretcher or your strainer bar. You don't want to go too far where you're poking out the face. So you want to be really careful about how you measure that. You want to be very specific. The other thing is that in order to get this nice gap space, which is usually about 1/8 of an inch there, I like to cut little strips of foam board. And as I'm framing it to keep my painting centered, I'll put them at the top, the bottom, each side as spacers so that all those gaps are the same measurement. And then, of course, you're going to want to pre-drill and countersink. If it doesn't come with already pre-screwed, pre-drilled, which usually some of them do, some of them don't. If it's not pre-drilled, you want to make sure that you countersink your holes. And that means that when a countersink, that's, you have your pilot hole, but then in addition to that, it'll be kind of a little bit sunken down into the wood. Kind of like that. So that the head of your screw is going to be flush or below the surface of your floater frame. And again, it won't kind of drag or scratch the wall when you hang it up.
Okay, full confession here. Like I have struggled with that. And like I end up just like compensating by putting big bumpers on the back because, I put on the D-rings, I put on the offset things, and then I've had it happen in my own house, paintings I bought even from other artists, where I take it down a year later to dust it or clean it, and my wall is all scratched up because the screws were sticking out. So I try and be really conscientious that something that I'm going to sell is not going to scratch up my client's wall because they'll never come back and buy from me.
Right.
And it's just rude not to think about taking care of their home so that you're not damaging their walls. But I didn't really know how to do it because I didn't know how to countersink the screws.
So when you go to the hardware store and get yourself a special countersink bit. There's 2 different kinds. And I can help you. Maybe this will be another follow-up session because I do want to talk about design today. But there's 2 different types of countersink bits. There's one where it's kind of all integrated. So you have your regular drill bit, and then at the very end, I'll draw you another picture. Sorry. And then at the very end, there's the countersink part.
I believe ampersand floater frames all come with the countersink.
So here, and then this part goes into your drill. So it looks, I'm sorry, I'm just doing this really quickly.
That's okay.
But here, this will be, this normal size of your drill bit. And then this part up here, this is where the countersink starts. So these are really great, especially if you have a system. So you're like, these are the screws that I use. They're the same size screw. Say they're all number 6. They're all, but you have them in different lengths. It's nice to have some sort of system, some consistency, which will help you going forward. So every time you go to try to do something, you're like, I have the tools to do the job and I have the materials to do the job. Having those kind of systems is going to make framing a lot easier than if you're hunting through junk drawers, looking for random screws and that kind of a thing. So say you've got your number 6 screws, say you've got them in 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch, 1 1/4 inch, right? And you know that this drill bit is really good for your number 6 screws. Then you're going to figure out the countersink that also fits with your screws, and it'll be just a simple, one and done. This is the drill bit that you need. It works with the screws that you've got. So do yourself a favor and go to a decent hardware store where someone can show you some tools, who can help you, who can make sure that your materials are compatible, and that this is what you need. The other type of countersink is separate. So you have your normal drill bit. That's the one that you like. Maybe you have a set of different sizes that you use for different things. And then in addition, you have a set of countersinks. So the countersinks are separate, and they are just for making that little depression so that the head of your screw is flush with your frame. So that there's two different approaches. They're both great. A lot of the new ones, like if you buy something today, it's going to be integrated. If you have something that you bought in the 70s, it's going to be the separate. They're both great, just different approaches to woodworking. And I can't stress enough how important it is to measure. The other thing that I don't know if I clarified was that, you know, if you're working on a panel, panels are, of course, rigid, which is why we like them. You don't have to worry as much about putting the backing board on a panel. So I'm not expecting to see an influx of panels from everyone that have backing boards on them. I am expecting to see canvases, unframed canvases with backing boards. Okay, last question or two before we jump into design.
It's Katie here. I have a specific question to a type of frame that I use. So I don't know how useful this will be to other people, but I use the interlocking metal frames for my prints. And I can't figure out how to put a backing sheet on those. I used to always put a backing sheet with the double-sided tape on wooden frames, but now that I'm using those, they have sort of a gutter. And so I don't know how to put a backing on those, but I agree one is needed.
That's a great question. So metal frames, which we haven't really gotten into, they're great. They're simple, they're clean profiles, they're easy to DIY. I highly recommend, you know, if it works with your aesthetic, to absolutely investigate metal frames. But Katie, you're right in that it's a different format than a wooden frame. Now, I think I had a diagram on one of my slides, so I'm going to just go back to screen sharing to see if I can find that. So this here on my spacers, this is a wooden frame. This one here, this is a metal frame. So this is that gutter that you're talking about, Katie.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
there's no way, you're absolutely right. Not only is the hardware going to be different, so you're going to need to get metal specific D-rings. The only type of D-rings that you can really put on a metal frame are the ones that are designed to work with it. So
Right.
I really like the Nielsen frames.
Okay.
And I really like the Nielsen, and when you get a Nielsen frame, they're designed to work with the Nielsen hardware. So make sure that the hardware that you're getting for the metal frames to interconnect them, as you were saying, is also made by Nielsen, because it'll just be a tighter, flusher corner. Now, for metal frames, you don't really do backing paper. You don't do dust cover. But what you do have to make sure is that within this framing package that you have it pretty nice and tight. And one of the most important things about metal frames is that you do not over tighten your spring clips. So your spring clips, I'm sorry, I'm going to draw again. And I'll go and I'll look at this. I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm learning. So that is roughly what your spring clip looks like. You want to flatten that out to be the least amount of pressure putting on your glass. I've fixed more broken glass as a picture framer from spring clips being as tight as possible. And that is just not the way you want. So you want them to be like, you know, you want them to fill the gap that's in your frame. So when you shake your frame, you don't hear a rattle, but you don't want them to be super, super tight. So one thing that I like to do is for that back piece of foam core or backing board that's going to be on the back of that metal frame, I like it to be a piece of black foam core, or if you can get a scrap piece of mat that's, you know, it could be white, it could be, you know, but you know that it's going to be facing out. So you want it to look presentable. I think the black personally looks the nicest, but as long as it's clean, and I love when artists put their business card, I love when people date it, I love when they include, you know, maybe even what show it's been in, or shows if it's been in a lot of other shows. I think that's kind of fun information to have as a collector. But I hope that answers your question.
It does. It just is basically not possible to put a backing sheet.
Nope.
And what I ran into a problem at the SHAFE exhibit where I ended up with a little no-see-um inside of one of my frames. So, but there's no way to, you know, prevent that really.
If that happened, okay, we're gonna go back to screen share and back to my presentation. And here we go. So there's something called frame sealing tape. So if that was an issue for you and you're exhibiting in a place that's like the Sheaf Warehouse where things are a little bit more rustic because, you know, it's right on the water there. Now, unfortunately, the small size here is out of stock, but this one here, this Lineco frame sealing tape, it's aluminum tape with paper backing on it. Something like this is a really cool, fun tape to play around with and try. And I would, you know, first step is instead of using the spring clips, I would probably fill up your frame as much as possible with foam core. And then there would be not a huge gap in between the edge of your metal frame and the foam core backing. And I would put a very clean, you know, precise line of this tape around those edges.
All right.
That's what I would do if I had that problem in the past.
All right, then that's helpful. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. And then I did just want to show you the hinging tape while we're here because Lenny had asked to see that and I didn't really get into that. So I love this company, Lineco, or as they say, I think he's Australian in that video I shared, Lineco. But this Haiku hinging paper here, this is exactly the product that he used. This is a really nice balance between archival conservation quality. It's not quite 100% conservation, but it's definitely archival and it's easy to use. So he uses a paintbrush in the video. I actually just lick it because I feel like I can control the amount of moisture that I'm using a little bit better. It's, you know, this is basically the T-hinge that I showed you in the video. And then it's just a great product. I also, if I'm doing some of my own printmaking, and I have a lot of printmaking paper and supplies in my own studio. So I have Japanese paper that I have methyl cellulose and rice starch, and because I do collage. So if you have those types of really conservation materials in your studio and you're like, hey, I don't want to spend $20 to buy this fancy tape when I can make my own I can use my own Japanese paper that I already have. It's a scrap off this print. And I've also got, you know, the different starches available to me to mix up my own pastes and glues. That is a better way to do it. But for those of us that don't want to be professional framers, that want to focus on creating artwork instead, this is kind of a nice little in-between. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about that offline as well. So I think now it's time to jump into some of my frame design advice. And I think we will still have plenty of time for questions as we go through this. I have a lot of like little rules that I've set for myself about framing. Almost all the pictures that I'm going to share with you are pieces from my personal collection. I just kind of, as I was prepping for this, took pictures of stuff that was around my house. So sorry for some of the sorry for the reflections in the glass. But a lot of my rules are to keep it simple, make sure that the artwork is what shines. In terms of pricing your artwork, if you're spending a lot on your framing, or maybe you're not spending money, but you're spending time, make sure that you double the cost of your framing to add it to the price that you're charging your collectors. Pay attention to contrast. You don't want there to be more contrast in the framing than in the art. And as just a general rule throughout all of this, keep things balanced. So just to start the conversation, and I know that there are going to be people who are like, that's terrible, I hate it. I chose a bunch of different things to give you different perspectives on what's right or wrong. But basically, you don't want anyone to look at your framed piece of art and say, I'm not buying that because of the frame. So make the artwork shine. So this piece here, this is a little diptych I did when I was in college. The frame has some texture on it, but it's black. The mat board is black. So when I look at it, I see immediately where the artwork is versus where the frame is. Now, this aesthetic probably won't work for everyone. Maybe some of you don't like it. Maybe some of you like it. But for me, I liked the simplicity of it. I like that the artwork is the thing that pops out to me before anything else. This is float mounted, so you can see the entire edge, and I used a spacer in order to keep the glass from touching. I also, on this piece, used a higher end art glass, there's different types of glasses that are anti-reflective. They're called art glass or museum glass. And both of them really do a lot to improve the clarity of the piece because you don't see as many reflections. You do see in this photo that the reflections almost have kind of a blue-green tone, which I've noticed is pretty common. Whereas this piece down here, this is a piece that I picked up from a Worcester artist, John Pagano. And this has regular conservation clear glass on it. So it's still UV filtered, but I do think you can see a little difference in the reflections. Now, this piece is very contemporary, abstract, on white paper. Something that I like to do is to kind of show where the artwork is versus where the framing is. And this I thought was nice because I'm showing the entire piece of art. Again, it's floated and I put a spacer on it. And then the gray, it's not like an intense color, but it's just a nice little buffer between it being completely white. I think a lot of artists would be inclined to frame a piece like this with a white mat and a white frame. And for me, sometimes I worry about that washing out the artwork. So I tend to do like these light, pale, neutral tones that might not necessarily be white, but are very neutral to the artwork.
Amanda?
Yes.
On that upper one in your previous frame there, where you're showing the edge of the paper, how are you mounting the artwork to the backing? Because the hinge is going to show.
That's a great question. So we back up here. Ooh, this one, how to float mount. So do you want to take a second? It's, I think, another 4 minutes. We can watch this video and it'll show you how to do it. Basically, it's the same process that I showed you in the first video where you are creating the hinges on the back. But instead of just having, one here, you're also going to have 1 or 2 at the bottom. And you want to make sure that on the back you have your hinge a little bit further down, like about right, about depending on the size of the art, it's all relative. So then what I would do is when I have my my hinge, is this part gets folded and it slides through a little slit that you cut in the mat board. And then this folds down and you do your T hinge on the back. So it is a T hinge, and it is the same type of hinging that I showed you in the first video, except you're going to put, this on the back, your hinge on the back of the artwork. You're going to have 2 or 3. I think sometimes on the bottom, I usually always put one on the bottom, but loose. I don't pull it tight at the bottom. I leave a little bit of room for expansion and contraction. And then this is going to get threaded through your mat and then folded down with another T piece that goes over that. Is that enough of an explanation without doing the video?
Yeah, we'll watch the video later. Thanks.
Cool. Also, another way while I have this open is you can do what's called a V hinge, which is right here, where you kind of take your hinge. So again, let's assume this is the hinge, and I fold it to make a V shape. And you can then, I would lick it, but you can use a paintbrush with a little bit of water on it and activate your adhesive on both sides of your hinge and stick that underneath the art where you want it to go. So there's 2 options, this option here or the pass-through method that I just told you about, which is in the video. I would say that when you're doing diptychs, sometimes it's a little trickier to get it to line up perfectly, but you know, a good ruler, some nice paperweights, and you'll be fine. So this is a piece that I saw at NHAA, and I just really liked the way that they had framed them. So there are ways where, okay, you've got this really bright white paper and the mat matches the color of the paper, but the texture is really different. And that's a way where you can kind of, I love playing with texture in framing. And getting a linen mat or a silk mat or something like that is a way to do it. But again, I'm not using contrast with color. In this case, the artist has chosen just a really simple natural maple frame. And then they have the contrast going on with the texture, but not color. And I have a close-up of it so you can really see that linen texture here. Moving on to the next one, playfully restrained. So again, I don't want anyone to be in the gallery looking at your artwork and saying, oh, you know, that's a really nice piece, except I'm gonna have to reframe it now. So you do want to keep any like bold choices to a minimum. Like I wouldn't recommend a bright colored mat, but in this case, this piece, which was given to me by a friend, it has this kind of rustic folk art quality to it. It's a reduction linotype. So I decided to be really simple with the matting, and again, just use a white that matches the color of the paper, but then to put a gray, because the background here is gray, with a little bit of distressing. So, and I have another close-up of this right here. So you can see that there is like a nice amount of texture in the frame itself. But when you look at the whole piece overall, the dark gray of the frame kind of contains the piece, but it's not, you know, it's not screaming at you like, here's a big frame, you know, which is something that always, you know, whenever I'm thinking about framing, I'm thinking about balance, the balance of aesthetics. And then this is similar in this frame here. I got this painting. It's of my favorite bookstore from my hometown. And the artist had already framed it. And I thought, you know what? I'm fine with that. I'm not gonna really overthink it because normally I have to reframe everything. But I thought that it was just simple, nice. The blue might be like, if I were to choose it myself, I would probably pick something that was a little bit more in this like neutral gray taupe color. But I also kind of appreciated for what this was. It was fun, playful, while still being simple and still highlighting, you know, this color blue is different from the blue of the frame, which is important because I wouldn't want this color blue to compete. I want my eye to be drawn to Canio's books. I don't want it to be drawn to the blue of the frame. So even though this, you know, there's good things and bad things about this piece, the way that it was framed, I wanted to show this as an example of a way that if you do want to add color, you can, but you don't want it to compete with the colors that are in the painting itself. This one has really bad reflection in it, I'm sorry, but you can still get the idea of when you're looking at your artwork, you want to differentiate if it's warm or cool tones. In this case, it has a lot of these kind of like natural green tones, and it's a warm piece. So instead of doing, say, like a cool gray of the same level of tone, just a very like light neutral color, I went with a warm tone because it helps warm up the piece and it looks more neutral and it harmonizes with the photograph better. So that's always a really great starting point. I'm giving you all these little design tips, like the warm and cool tones, I think is probably one of the most important ones. If you're someone who likes metal frames, whether that is gold leaf or silver, or the Nielsen metal frames that I was mentioning, they have the Nielsen, they have one called German silver. It's one of my favorite frame colors. It's that perfect warm tone that's not gold and it's not silver, but it works really well with a lot of just like slightly warm things. So if you use, any earth tones in your work, that's going to pair really well with it. Now, if on the same side, if you have things that are really cool in that icy blue range, then putting something warm on it is going to create a ton of contrast between the warm and cool colors. So in that case, you'd be better off going with something that was, more like what we have going on over here with the blue. Or in the Nielsen range, they have just a plain silver, and their plain silver is very cool. This is another one of my pieces. So you get a little insight into some of my art collection and my artwork, in addition to learning about frame design, where I like things to be neutral, but neutral doesn't have to mean white. So I have this gray mat here. So I like to tear my own paper and create these natural edges. So you can see this whole natural edge around my piece. It's kind of, I wanted to expose these plate marks because it's a mixed media print and it has a lot of different plate marks and things going on in it that is part of the look. And so to offset that, I use this, medium gray mat, but then I put it's kind of a pearly white frame on it. And this way the two whites connect. And this is a warm white printmaking paper. So I didn't put a cool white frame on it. I put a slightly warm pearly frame on it. Again, keeping in mind my warm and cool tones. And what I like about this is that, it's the orange tones and like this yellow ochre color that really pops. And just a way for you to think about neutral without necessarily being 100% white. Sometimes neutral is leaning into the warmer, cool tones. Sometimes it's adding a touch of contrast. And if you look at this from across the room, you can see where the artwork begins and ends. That's something that's important to me. The other thing about it is if you imagine this was all white and you looked at it from across the room, I think it would feel a little bit washed out. This would become the most dominant piece in the artwork because it's the most highly pigmented, it's the darkest thing in the piece is this. So I don't know. I think it's better with the gray. But, everyone has their own aesthetic. Now, I realized that I had all these really minimalist things and I was like, all right, I got to throw in something that's a little bit more ornate. So for this tip, I put, don't be afraid of wide frames or ornamentation. And in this case, all of the other pieces that I've shown, almost all of the other pieces I've shown you had a mat. This one doesn't have a mat. And part of that was because I really wanted to make it look like a painting. This was a piece of needlepoint that my grandma did for me. And I wanted to lean into these curves here. It's all very curving. Her body's very curving and round. I liked, again, in terms of color wise being neutral, black would compete with the black outline of her body. If I went with a gray, orange, flesh tone, brown, or yellow, that would be adding too much color to it as well. So this is a warm silver frame. I love warm silver because I just find it to be very neutral with a lot of pieces. And when I look at it, to me, it almost kind of feels like it has like a museum treatment to it, which is what I want it to do because it's a special piece to me. And if you really zoom in, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the background of this ornamentation is like this little dotting, which really works well with the texture of the stitching and the fiber art. So those are all little considerations that go into picking a frame design. You certainly don't have to go ornate. And this is the kind of one where, again, I would say, you know, the frame becomes a big part of the overall look. This can be good or bad. For what I wanted for this piece, I wanted it to look like an oil painting. I wanted it to look like it had the museum treatment and like it had like a special designation in my collection. And I also wanted to, you know, kind of do a little juxtaposition of it having a more special ornate frame with it being a, you know, a fiber art piece from my grandma. So all of that went into the decision making, which I would say is good. But if this were a piece that you were selling in at the NHAA, I would say that's a lot of look, you know? So definitely think about that in terms of how you're going to explain it to the buyer, how you're going to explain it to me so I can sell it for you. I think you're getting where I'm going with this, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that. And this is my last slide. So I have, I put all of these things in here so you can check out this website. And we kind of touched on all of these and I got to walk you through the website a little bit. These are another kind of hanger that are the infinity hangers. They're smaller than D-rings if you're working on something really small and you need something specific like that. But I want to open up for questions and I'll stop my screen share, but we can revisit it at any point because I'd love to hear about your thoughts about some of the artwork that I showed you and answer more design questions.
I have a question, Amanda.
Go for it.
All right, so when I travel and I'm planning on doing a painting traveling venture this summer, and the last 2 summers I went to Monhegan. So I had David Pratt Company a couple years ago take archival watercolor paper that I then and they pre-adhered it to, I think it was some kind of foam core or something that was archival so that it had a stiff backing.
Yes.
Because I prepared it for oil painting actually by gessoing it. So I had a whole stack of them that I could put in a travel case and bring down with me. And they said if I had brought the paintings back after, if I had just painted on the paper, clipped to a board, and then they had to adhere it, that they put it in this high heat press and that it would crush some of the texture of the paint. So I'm contemplating, looking forward to doing a solo show this coming year. And I'm thinking I'm going to have everything on like sort of frameless on paper adhered to cradled board, or maybe ampersand boards that are cradled, but you can't use them for plein air painting. Like if you try and bring out a cradled piece of wood outside, it won't fit on any plein air easel. So
yeah,
I'm trying to figure out, like, so if I want to paint on paper in Europe, when I go to Italy, like to prepare the paper and then bring it back and then adhere it to like an ampersand board or a cradled board, what would be your advice?
So I would say paper is great for artists, right? It's cheap, it's portable, it's a wonderful material, but it does create these more challenges when it comes to framing. And what you're saying by wanting to adhere it to a cradled board is that you want that oil paint look and you want the simplicity of just having your piece directly on a board, maybe with a floater frame if you choose, but it could also just be without a floater frame. And this does take some planning, so I'm glad that we're talking about it now before you start painting. One of
Me too.
the big things that I would say is whenever you're doing heat, there is that risk of changing the texture of the paint, and especially because those heat presses are heat vacuum. So it's the double whammy of warming it up and sucking it down. So make sure that, and it's tricky because the papers that you're using are heavier when you're painting on like, this is probably heavier paper. It's not like a thin tissue. So in order to get like a really good bond, you're going to want a panel that is not necessarily like a gessoed panel, but a panel that has some texture to it so that it'll really take to the paper and take to the adhesive. The other thing is that you're going to want to use paper that I would try to make sure that your paper is just a little bit bigger than your panels, so that if you have a little adjustment that you need to make at the end, you can trim off a little edge of that paper, and you won't ever be in the situation where you're short on your image. So that's something to think about too. In terms of the actual adhesives, this is a really tricky question because there are a lot of different options that you have. And what I'm going to suggest, some conservators might not even say is the most conservation, but it is definitely going to be more user-friendly and easier for you to use. So I would probably say mixing a PVA glue with a little bit of methyl cellulose. That would be my recommendation. The methyl cellulose is going to give you a longer drying time than a straight PVA glue. And your PVA glue should be as archival as you can find. So you want something that's acid-free and buffered. So do you know what I mean by working time? Like it's the same thing. Like if you're working with an acrylic paint and it dries really quickly, the methyl cellulose kind of serves as a medium, if you will, to help retard the drying. So you want to mix just a little bit of that methyl cellulose in there to help slow it down. And you're going to want to be pretty generous with it, but you're going to have I would definitely do a test. Make sure, like, do a test piece where you're like, maybe it's a piece of paper that you just like really, you gesso and you do like a 5-minute study on, let it dry. That's a piece that you're going to throw away. That's the one that you tested on. They have like these beautiful Japanese brushes that are really nice and wide with short bristles. That's what I would use to get a nice thin coating on the back. And then the most important part is going to be weighting it. So if you have a heavy piece of glass, that's ideal. If you don't, there's a lot of book binding materials that would be really helpful, but any kind of really heavy and uniform weight that you can put on top is going to be key, because once you have it all glued down and just how you like it, you're going to need to let that cure. You could also take it to Deep Pratt and pay them to do it.
Yeah, sounds really scary, all of this.
I use a bag of kitty litter on top of the cradled piece, a flat board, and then a kitty litter, because it goes to it shapes itself to the shape of whatever it is you're pressing down.
I love that. It's a good tip. Any other questions about design? I know that I kind of went through that pretty quickly, and I know that people have a lot of different, opinions about what's right. There's, the amount of times when I've heard, a black frame and a white mat is how things should be framed. And I just try to be like, sometimes if you're a black and white photographer, thumbs up. If you're doing anything with color, maybe not. But really, this is for you guys. So, I can talk about other framing experiences or things that I've had. But I just want everyone to feel like they're getting the maximum benefit. So shoot me an email if you have anything that comes up after maybe you're thinking about this and you're like, oh, she didn't touch about that. Thank you so much for participating, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work and friends and lovers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Quick
That was really
question,
helpful.
Amanda. Sorry.
No.
Quick question before I thank you. Well, I should thank you first, and then before I say goodbye. My Zoom died and I struggled for about 10 minutes, maybe even longer to get back in. So is there a slideshow that we can look at the slides? Because I missed, like, I was about, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes in, and then
Yep.
I
Everything's going to be posted to the member portal, and I'll make sure that the slides are there separately. And then I will also include this recording.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks
no
for
problem.
all the information you gave. It was great.
I'm glad
Great.
you enjoyed it. Thank
Learned a
you.
lot.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Amanda.
Amanda. That was very nice. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
There it is.